When you think about the Old West outlaws, the Dalton Brothers are near the top of the list. The Dalton Gang was notorious for their string of train and bank robberies in the late 1800s. I recently had the chance to visit the town where it all came crashing down for the Dalton Brothers on October 5th, 1892. I'm Jeff. Thanks for joining me today on Backroads Tourist. For 2.5 years, the Dalton Gang was accused of robberies all over the country, but operated mostly in California, Kansas, Oklahoma Territory, and Indian Territory. But all of that success went to their heads, and they started thinking they were invincible. Bob Dalton had the idea that he claimed he would do something that even Jesse James had never done: rob 2 banks at once in broad daylight. On that October day, Bob, Emmett, and Grat Dalton, along with other gang members, Bill Power and Dick Broadwell, set their sights on the First National Bank and the Condon Bank, which was right across the street in Coffeyville, Kansas. Grat, Broadwell, and Power would take the Condon Bank, while Emmett and Bob would rob the First National Bank. They tied their horses in an alley and started walking towards the banks. As they did that, people started recognizing them, and while they were busy robbing the banks, the citizens of Coffeyville were arming themselves. Some even went to Isham's hardware store across the street and took guns from the shelves. Meanwhile, at the Condon Bank, Grat Dalton told the bank manager to open the safe, but the manager lied and told Grat that the safe was on a time delay and couldn't be opened for another 10 minutes. Grat believed him and decided to wait. This delay gave more vigilantes a chance to get more guns. As the bank robbers tried to make their getaway, the townspeople opened fire. The shooting continued for about 15 minutes. Finally, the Dalton Gang made a run for their horses in the alley. After the gunfire stopped, Grat and Bob Dalton and Bill Power were all on the ground, lifeless. Dick Broadwell managed to ride away, but he was hit by gunfire several times and was found dead about 2 miles away. The only outlaw to survive was Emmett Dalton, and he had received 23 gunshot wounds. He was given a life sentence in the Kansas State Penitentiary, but was pardoned 14 years later. He died in 1937 at the age of 66. In Coffeyville, you can visit the building that housed the Condon Bank. It's been kept the way it was back in 1892. A member of the Visitors Bureau will give you a brief history and answer any questions. Otherwise, you're allowed to walk around and spend as much time exploring as you like. Just a few steps away from the bank is Isham's hardware store, where many townfolk armed themselves against the Dalton Gang. And right across the street is the Dalton Defenders Museum. It's a museum dedicated not to the Dalton Gang, but to the townspeople who rose up at a moment's notice and did what law enforcement couldn't do: take down the Dalton Gang. 4 defenders met their end as a result of the gun battle: Marshal C.T. Connolly, Lucius Baldwin, George Cubine, and Charles Brown. Right next to the museum is the alley where many of the Dalton Gang fell. Some call it Dalton Alley, but this sign gives it a more ominous name. Along the side of the alley is an artist rendering that, almost like a comic strip, gives you the details and the series of events that happened that day. On the ground, you can find outlines of where the outlaws drew their last breath. Before we visit the final resting place for most of the Dalton Gang, I'd like to ask you to please give this video a thumbs up and then subscribe to the Backroads Tourist channel. I'd appreciate it. The Elmwood Cemetery on the outskirts of town is where you'll find the graves of the Dalton Gang. Bob and Grat Dalton, along with Bill Power, are all buried together. Dick Broadwell's family claimed his body and buried him in Hutchinson, Kansas in an unmarked grave. For a long time, this metal post was thought to be the hitching post the Daltons used to tie up their horses while they robbed the banks, but this proved to be not true, and it was thought that this was just a random piece of scrap iron used to mark the graves for many years. The gravesite is on the east end of the cemetery, and even after all these years, it's still pretty far away from most of the other graves. So if you're a fan of the Old West, the Wild Wild West, and you find yourself in southeast Kansas, I'd encourage you to take some time to walk the streets, visit the bank and the hardware store where it all happened. It brings history to life more than just reading about it in a book or watching a story on TV. Thanks for watching today. I'm Jeff, and I'll see you on the Backroads.